If you enjoy a good scare with a terrifying tale, well, when it comes to true terror, fiction does not hold a candle to real-life events, especially in the case of the Viscilla Axe Murders. Sit back, listener, and hold your loved one close, because you are about to hear the true story of the horrors that happened in Villisca, Iowa. The Viscilla Axe Murders occurred during the night of June 9th to the early morning of June 10th, 1912, in the town of Villisca, Iowa, in the United States. The 6 members of the Moore family and 2 guests were found bludgeoned in the Moore residence. All 8 victims, including 6 children, had severe head wounds from an axe. A lengthy investigation yielded several suspects, one of whom was tried twice. The first trial ended in a hung jury, and the second ended in an acquittal. The house was restored in the 1990s and is known as the Viscilla Axe Murder House. The victims consisted of parents Josiah B., age 43, Sarah Montgomery, age 39, and their 4 children, Herman Montgomery, aged 11, Mary Catherine, aged 10, Arthur Boyd, aged 7, and Paul Vernon, aged 5. An affluent family, the Moores were well known and well liked in their community. On June 9, 1912, Mary Catherine Moore invited Ina May, aged 8, and Lena Gertrude Stillinger, aged 12, to spend the night at the Moore residence. The house was restored in the 1990s and is known as the Viscilla Axe Murder House. The victims consisted of parents Josiah B., aged 43, Sarah Montgomery, aged 39, and their 4 children, Herman Montgomery, aged 11, Mary Catherine, aged 10, Arthur Boyd, aged 7, and Paul Vernon, aged 5. An affluent family, the Moores were well known and well liked in their community. On June 9, 1912, Mary Catherine Moore invited Ina May, aged 8, and Lena Gertrude Stillinger, aged 12, to spend the night at the Moore residence. That evening, the visiting girls and the Moore family attended the Presbyterian Church, where they participated in the Children's Day program, which Sarah had coordinated. After the program ended at 9:30 p.m., the Moores and the Stillinger sisters walked to the Moore's house, arriving between 9:45 and 10 p.m. At 7 a.m. the next day, June 10th, Mary Peckham, the Moore's neighbor, became concerned after she noticed that the family had not come out to do their morning chores. Peckham knocked on the Moore's door. When nobody answered, she tried to open the door and discovered that it was locked. Peckham let the Moore's chickens out and called Ross Moore, Josiah's brother. Like Peckham, Moore received no response when he knocked on the door and shouted. Ross unlocked the front door with his copy of the house key. While Peckham stood on the porch, Ross went into the parlor and opened the guest bedroom door, where he found Ina and Lena Stillinger's bodies on the bed. Moore immediately told Peckham to call Henry Hank Horton, Villisca's primary peace officer, who arrived shortly thereafter. Horton's search of the house revealed that the entire Moore family and the 2 Stillinger girls had been bludgeoned to death. The murder weapon, an axe belonging to Josiah, was found in the guest room where the Stillinger sisters were found. Doctors concluded that the murders had taken place between midnight and 5 a.m. 2 spent cigarettes in the attic suggested that the killer or killers patiently waited. According to the official tour, there were no cigarettes found in the attic until the Moore family and the Stillinger guests were asleep. The killer began in the master bedroom, where Josiah and Sarah Moore were sleeping. Josiah received more blows from the axe than any other victim. His face had been cut to such an extent that his eyes were completely destroyed. The ceiling in his room also had a gouge mark from when the murderer lifted the axe to murder him. The killer or killers used the blade of the axe on Sarah, while using the blunt end on the rest of the victims. Herman, Mary Catherine, Arthur, and Paul were next bludgeoned in the head in the same manner as their parents. Afterwards, the murderer returned to the master bedroom to inflict more blows on the elder Moores, knocking over a shoe that had filled with blood from the previous attack, before moving downstairs to the guest bedroom and killing Ina and Lena. Seemingly afterwards, a 4-ohm slab of bacon was taken out of the icebox and laid next to the axe. Investigators also found untouched food and bloody water on the kitchen table during the search. Investigators believed that all of the victims except for Lena Stillinger had been asleep when murdered. They thought that she was awake and tried to fight back, as she was found lying crosswise on the bed, and with a defensive wound on her arm. Lena was lying on her stomach, her posterior in the air. Lena's body had also been moved and her undergarments removed. Her leg had been positioned in such a way to reveal her genitalia. This led to law enforcement speculation that the killers sexually molested her or attempted to do so. Later investigations showed no evidence of this. In another bizarre twist, every mirror in the house was covered with blankets, clothing, or any means of covering. Garments were removed from the dressers to cover the mirrors. After the search of the house, people were led into the house to view the scene. At around 8:40 a.m., the town's central telephone office issued an all-call alert, advising every household in the town of the murders. Within minutes, the house was rushed by townsfolk. This completely contaminated the scene, with some people even stealing pieces of Josiah's skull as souvenirs. The murder weapon was handled by hundreds that came through the house. The sheriff was unable to gain control of the scene for hours. The county coroner, Dr. Lindquist, arrived at the scene of the crime at approximately 9 a.m. After viewing the scene himself, he met with Horton, who had been the town's night watchman that Sunday, and Sheriff Orrin Jackson to review the information they had collected. Lindquist was upset by the constant influx of townsfolk interfering with the investigation and urged the sheriff to get the National Guard to secure the scene. By 10:30 a.m., the National Guard had established a secure perimeter to keep people out. A local druggist whose hobby was photography showed up to take photos, but he was dismissed and told taking photos was too ghoulish. He may have had an economic motive. Many drugstores sold postcards of crime scenes at the time. Although Lindquist called members of the coroner's jury together in late afternoon, it was several hours before they entered the Moore home to view the bodies. After 10 p.m., he called County Attorney Ratcliffe to finally give permission to the undertaker to remove them. The fire station had been set up as a temporary morgue, and it was close to 2 a.m. before all the bodies had been transported there, likely around 24 hours after the murders occurred. Doctors estimated the murders occurred between midnight and 2 a.m. The victims' autopsies revealed all died from severe head trauma. Some wondered how a murderer could maneuver in a compact, creaking farmhouse without waking anyone. At the time, newspapers proffered a theory that the murderer put a sedative in milk or cocoa eaten by the family, but toxicology studies weren't a routine part of autopsies at the time. Investigators found an imprint in the hay in the barn next to a knothole, where they believed the killer observed the family for some time. 2 spent cigarettes found in the attic suggested the murderer could have entered the house via a window or unlocked back door and hid until the family returned from church. 2 curious bits of evidence were uncovered: a gas lamp with its glass chimney removed, and its wick turned down so it would give off only the faintest bit of light, was discovered upstairs. A fragment of a keychain, not belonging to any member of the Moore family, was found downstairs. After this limited investigation, the coroner held an inquest the next day, June 11, 1912, where 13 people were interviewed as potential witnesses. Over time, many possible suspects emerged, including Reverend George Kelly, Frank F. Jones, William Mansfield, Loving Mitchell, Paul Mueller, and Henry Lee Moore. No relation. Kelly was tried twice for the murder. The first trial ended in a hung jury, while the second ended in an acquittal. Other suspects in the investigation were also exonerated. Findings for each suspect, starting with Andrew Sawyer. Every transient and otherwise unaccounted for stranger was a suspect in the murders. Andrew Sawyer was one of those people. He was interrogated, but not charged. He was obsessed with the murders and slept fully clothed, as if he was ready to make a clean getaway, and he also slept with an axe by his bed. Reverend George Kelly. Kelly was an English-born traveling minister in town on the night of the murders. Kelly was described as peculiar, reportedly having suffered a mental breakdown as an adolescent. As an adult, he was accused of peeping and several times asking young women and girls to pose nude for him. On June 8, 1912, he came to Villisca to teach at the Children's Day services, which the Moore family attended on June 9, 1912. He left town between 5 o'clock a.m. and 5:50 a.m. on June 10, 1912, hours before the bodies were discovered. Reverend Kelly had confessed to the murders in court, but the jury did not believe his confession. In the weeks that followed, he displayed a fascination with the case and wrote many letters to the police, investigators, and family of the deceased. This aroused suspicion, and a private investigator wrote back to Reverend Kelly, asking for details that the minister might know about the murders. Kelly replied with great detail, claiming to have heard sounds and possibly witnessed the murders. His known mental illness made authorities question whether he knew the details because of having committed the murders or was imagining his account. In 1914, 2 years after the murders, Kelly was arrested for sending obscene material through the mail. He was sexually harassing a woman who applied for a job as his secretary. He was sent to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, the National Mental Hospital in Washington, D.C. Investigators speculated again that Kelly could be the murderer of the Moore family. In 1917, Kelly was arrested for the Villisca murders. Police obtained a confession from him. However, it followed many hours of interrogation, and Kelly later recanted. After 2 separate trials, he was acquitted. Frank Fernando Jones was a Villisca resident and an Iowa state senator. Josiah Moore had worked for Frank Jones at his implement store for many years before leaving to open his own store. Moore reportedly took business away from Jones, including a very successful John Deere dealership. Moore was rumored to have had a sexual affair with Jones's daughter-in-law, though no evidence supports this. William Mansfield. Another theory was that Senator Jones hired William "Insane Blackie" Mansfield, an ex-convict and former U.S. Army soldier stationed at Fort Leavenworth, to murder the Moore family. 9 months before the murders at Villisca, a similar case of axe murder occurred in Colorado Springs, Colorado. 2 axe murder cases followed in Ellsworth, Kansas, and Paula, Kansas. The cases were similar enough to raise the possibility of having been committed by the same person. Other murders reported as possibly being linked to these crimes include the numerous unsolved axe murders along the Southern Pacific Railroad from 1911-1912, the unsolved Axeman of New Orleans killings, as well as several other such murders during this time period. The murders in Colorado Springs were closely related in execution to those in the Moore house. H.C. Wayne, his wife and child, and Mrs. A.J. Burnham were found dead, murdered with an axe. Bed sheets were used to cover the windows to prevent passers-by from looking in. At the Moore house, the murderer hung aprons and skirts to cover the windows. As in the murders in Villisca, the murderer in Colorado Springs wiped the blood off his axe and covered the heads of the victims with bedclothes. Mansfield was also the prime suspect of the Burns Detective Agency of Kansas City and Detective James Newton Wilkerson, who suggested that he was a cocaine-addicted serial killer. According to contemporary news reports, Wilkerson believed Mansfield was responsible for the axe murders of his wife, infant child, father-in-law, and mother-in-law in Blue Island, Illinois, on July 5, 1914, 2 years after the Villisca murders. The axe murders committed in Paula, Kansas, 4 days before the Villisca murders, and the murders of Jenny Peterson and Jenny Miller in Aurora, Illinois. According to Wilkerson's investigation, all of the murders were committed in precisely the same manner, indicating that the same man probably committed them. Wilkerson stated that he could prove that Mansfield was present in each of the differing crime scenes on the night of the murders. In each murder, the victims were hacked to death with an axe, and the mirrors in the homes were covered. A burning lamp with the chimney off was left at the foot of the bed, and a basin in which the murderer washed was found in the kitchen. In each case, the murderer avoided leaving fingerprints by wearing gloves, which Wilkerson believed was strong evidence that the man was Mansfield, who knew his fingerprints were on file at the federal military prison at Leavenworth. Wilkerson managed to convince a grand jury to open an investigation in 1916, and Mansfield was arrested and brought to Montgomery County from Kansas City. Payroll records, however, provided an alibi that placed Mansfield in Illinois at the time of the Villisca murders. He was released for a lack of evidence, and later won a lawsuit he brought against Wilkerson, and was awarded $2,225. Wilkerson believed that pressure from Jones resulted not only in Mansfield's release, but also in the subsequent arrest and trial of Reverend Kelly. However, R.H. Thorpe, a restaurant owner from Shenandoah, Iowa, identified Mansfield as the man he saw the morning after the Villisca murders, boarding a train at Clarinda. This man said he had walked from Villisca. If proven to be true, this testimony would disprove Mansfield's alibi. Furthermore, it was reported that a Mrs. Vena Tompkins, of Marshalltown, was on her way to testify that she heard 3 men in the woods plotting the murder of the Moore family a short time before the killings. Henry Lee Moore was a suspected serial killer, who was not related to the slain Moore family, who was convicted of the murder of his mother and grandmother several months after the murders in Villisca, his weapon of choice being an axe. Before and after the murders in Villisca, The very similar axe murders of his mother and grandmother were committed, and all of the cases showed striking similarities, leading to strong suspicion that some or all of the crimes were committed by an axe-murdering serial killer. And, just like Blackie Mansfield, the axe-murdering Henry Moore can also be considered a suspect in some of these slayings. At the inquest, it was reported that Samuel Ronald Moyer, Josiah's brother-in-law, often threatened to kill Josiah Moore. However, upon further investigation, Moyer's alibi cleared him of the crime. Paul Mueller. In their 2017 book, The Man from the Train, Bill James and his daughter Rachel McCarthy James discuss the Villisca murders as part of a much larger series of murders, which they believe were all committed by a single serial killer. They concluded the murderer was Paul Mueller, an immigrant possibly from Germany, who was the subject of an unsuccessful year-long manhunt as the sole suspect in the 1897 murder of a family in West Brookfield, Massachusetts, who had employed him as a farmhand. Today, the house is a tourist destination in the small rural Iowa town of Villisca. A couple had purchased the home in 1995 and undone all the modern renovations to the house, restoring it to 1912 condition. The couple now offers tours and overnight stays in the house. Its selling point is that the house is now haunted because of the events that occurred in it.